I bought Elden Ring when it was first released back in 2022, mostly because I knew I could make a terrible 5-minute video of myself essentially getting mauled in the starting area in comedic ways over and over again. Naturally, at the time, this was £70 down the drain, as I had no intention or willpower to actually play Elden Ring. Fast forward to 2023. I was recently in a lecture at university, and we were discussing the difficulty of video games. During this discussion, I mentioned off the cuff that I found games like Elden Ring too hard. In response, I was rightfully clowned on, with someone even saying, skill issue. This created a spark in me that I had never experienced before. This spark ignited a fire of sheer willpower, persistence, and a healthy amount of spite, culminating in a promise that I would return to Elden Ring. I promised myself that I would be satisfied with my abilities if I could beat Godric the Grafted, whom I initially thought was the first main boss of Elden Ring, but I soon found myself outside Stormvale Castle, ready to face my foe. But then, I heard the iconic line,
Untarnished. In search of the Elden Ring.
and Margit the Fellowman appeared. This was a surprise for sure, one that slaughtered my character within seconds, but eventually, the Fellowman, fell, and I thought I would then happily clock out and never touch Elden Ring again. But then, something else interesting happened. I didn't do that. Instead, I pushed on, much further than I ever expected to go with this game. And before I knew it, the Elden Beast lay before me, a god felled by my hand. After 90 plus hours, my first playthrough of Elden Ring was finished. So let's talk about the gameplay of Elden Ring. We'll begin with our hero of this story. With your character, Elden Ring provides various methods of customization. From a starting class that provides you with the base stats you want, then from there, leveling up those stats over the course of your story. Maybe the player wants to be a high strength tank build, or a fast dexterity build, or a ranged arcane build. The possibilities are endless, and some work much better than others. For this undertaking, I created my character and named him Bingus Boboingus. I like to think that Bingus embodied my overall demeanour with Elden Ring, starting off scared, clueless, and desperate for any method of easily getting ahead, until he became an unstoppable machine of death, but would still use any method of getting ahead, but at least he looked way cooler now. On my second attempt at playing Elden Ring, I began to actually take the game seriously and consider the gameplay when constructing my character. With this in mind, I opted for a dexterity build that developed into a focus on bleed damage, which, according to the numerous guides I'd had consulted, a dexterity bleed build is one of, if not the most friendly playstyle for someone of my particular skill set, which can basically be summed up as A, not very good, B, can't time a parry if my life depended on it, and C, I enjoy hitting stuff. At points, I did feel like taking the easier road may take some of the spice out of the game, but this quickly vanished when I was still constantly and brutally assaulted by anything that moved. I realised I needed more firepower, to become so overpowered that absolutely nothing could touch me, to become the unstoppable god that the game wants me to become. And to do this, I took advantage of another mechanic that Elden Ring gives you, and that's the Spirit Ashes summons. The Spirit Ashes are NPCs summoned by you using either HP or FP. If you've played Elden Ring before, hearing what you've just heard about my build, and now me talking about summons, you probably know where I'm going here. I'm talking about the man, the myth, the meat shield. It's the Mimic Tear. The Mimic Tear is a summon that creates an exact copy of your player character to fight with you, meaning that everything your character does, including damage output, is effectively doubled. I cannot describe the amount of times I watched my own Mimic pull off moves that I didn't even know I could do, charging in and obliterating some of the hardest bosses without even breaking a sweat. The real MVP of my first Elden Ring playthrough wasn't me, it was me. Yeah, when it comes to combat in Elden Ring, no surprises here, it's difficult. But for me, it always stopped short of feeling unfair or impossible. No matter what profanity I screamed at my monitor, I could go from absolutely despising a boss, hating their moveset, their look, even mimicking them in mocking tones and cursing the very ground they walk on. Getting oddly personal about the whole thing, I won't lie. And once they've been dispatched, I do an immediate 180 of, wow, that was awesome and so well put together. There is this feeling of elation that would occur when I'd finally beaten a difficult boss, and it's a feeling I thought would dissipate over the next 90 hours of my playthrough, but it simply never goes away. It never stops feeling good, and it never stops feeling like an achievement. And whilst on the subject of difficulty, Souls games and difficulty settings have always been a topic of debate. Now, one camp insists that hard difficulty means accessibility gets left behind, while the other says that implementing a difficulty setting would cheapen the experience. For example, the Spirit Ashes can be considered one of Elden Ring's difficulty settings. They do allow a player to have a much easier time, but they still strike that balance between trivial and hard. A great example of this in action is when I took my Mimic to fight Moog. This entire fight lasted a minute and a half. I was very surprised at how easy this was, but as it turns out, my build was a direct counter to what Mo can do, and there was effectively two of me, so there it was. Meanwhile, when I brought the Mimic to fight Melania, I got slaughtered over and over and over again. Still, the Mimic is the singular reason I ended up prevailing in this fight. Not only in that fight itself, but in beating Elden Ring as a whole. I genuinely don't think I could have done it without the use of summons. At least not the first time around, which is kind of why I've resolved to try making it a bit more difficult on myself in the second playthrough by not using summons at all. Now, there is a bit of debate, especially when it comes to Elden Ring, about all the different methods that players use to get ahead. I disagree with the notion that players should feel any lesser in their abilities because they take advantage of features implemented by the developers. After all, it's why they were put there in the first place. In the words of the Doom Twitter account, you control the buttons you press, and you can make a game as easy or as difficult as you want. Hey, people on YouTube have made careers out of doing just that with Souls games. Elden Ring also has another key difference when it comes to previous Souls games. It is From Software's first open world game. So to state the obvious, if the player's struggling on a section, they can simply leave, do something else, and return later. This approach meant that for me, it wasn't always that feeling of constantly running at the same wall repeatedly. Instead, it felt like running at a big wall, failing, and then running off to find another smaller, less structurally sound wall. Which actually, nice segue there, Aaron, brings us to exploration. When it comes to exploration with Elden Ring, in direct contrast to its brutal and unrelenting combat loop, it was clear that the aim was to guide the player in the most gentle way possible. The game starts off with a very brief introduction to the concept of death, a mechanic that the player will become all too familiar with very soon. Then, the player is shoved into a vast starting area of Limgrave. The player is then trusted to find their own way and explore, with only faint directions from the Sights of Grace to guide the player in the direction of the main story. From Software's gentle guiding hand and its world design are perfect partners for the express reason that they both work in tandem to actively encourage the player to explore every single inch of the lands between. And with this, the world design provides a guarantee that the player's inquisitiveness will always be rewarded in some way. Sometimes, the reward may not be obvious. It could be something as simple as an interaction with an NPC or an object that may become vital later, but there is always a payoff in the end. I actually struggle to recall a single instance where exploration was not rewarded in some way. In the first few hours of Elden Ring, I realised that quests aren't necessarily something you always march towards, but rather something you stumbled into. But it's done in such a way that you never feel well and truly lost. Mostly due to a remarkable design of the world and Elden Ring's expertly crafted level of readability. Now, this approach to exploration is not flawless, as there were points, many of them actually, where I would have to look up how to do certain tasks and side quests, and my immediate thought after reading all these guides would always be the same. I never would have thought to do that. At points, a side quest can become a borderline directionless Easter egg hunt, especially if you don't dedicate the time to explore, but even then, there are cases where I'm genuinely stunned anyone managed to find this. I suppose that is by design. To do anything more than what it already does could run the risk of doing what every RPG does, creating an endless list of side quests, quickly becoming overwhelming to a point the player only does a handful of them. With Elden Ring, From Software makes it abundantly clear that this is the player's story to tell, and that the lands between aren't just any open world, but it is a world that is alive, and events will happen with or without you there. Now, moving on to the story section. Now, this one was a hell to write, but hey-ho. Like many other Souls games, the story of Elden Ring feels like it echoes through the dying world you occupy as a subtlety, rather than with a heavy hand. Though the story is good once you piece it together, the game is renowned for its excellent boss design and difficulty. However, the story does feed into your journey through the lands between quite nicely, so I went out of my way to try and understand it. So here is a really quick summary for those of you who might not know the story of Elden Ring. Oh, here we go. The Elden Ring is the power that governs the lands between. It does this through Queen Marika, its vessel. One night, Godwyn, the son of Marika, is assassinated. In turn, the Elden Ring is shattered and split amongst the Shard-bearers, primarily among the demigod offspring of Queen Marika. Most then move to war with one another, eventually leading to a never-ending stalemate between all parties involved. During this long stalemate, the Tarnished return to the lands between. You are one of the Tarnished, a people who were banished from the lands between long ago, brought back to your homeland by the light of lost grace. This is done in a last-ditch effort by the Erdtree to restore order to the lands between by making a Tarnished the new Elden Lord. Now, that covers the majority of what you need to know right as you are starting out in Elden Ring, but the finer details it leaves for the player to discover themselves either through item and object descriptions, or through 4-hour YouTube videos on the lore of Elden Ring. I settle for the latter. Big ups to Vati Vidya for that. Excellent videos on the Elden Ring lore, go watch them, I'll link them in the description. As you've probably already guessed by now, the story of Elden Ring is dense. And though every game gets better if you invest in the plot since the mechanics are often designed to reflect it, Elden Ring feels particularly unapologetic in how it presents its rich world. I really enjoy the fact that it never feels the need to explain itself. Rather, it allows the visual element to speak for itself and stand on its own without the need for the context behind it. A great example of this is how it presents the different environments of the lands between, such as the region of Caelid, a land scorched by war, then corrupted and consumed by the scarlet rot that has turned its lands plague-ridden, its skies a permanent colour of blood red, and has since become home to horrors of all shapes and sizes, all malformed and grotesque. When I entered Caelid for the first time, it became clear that the story of Elden Ring wasn't just another high fantasy, but more a post-apocalyptic tale set in the ruins of a once prominent civilization, now ravaged by a never-ending war between bickering demigods. I also quickly realised that most bosses encountered in Elden Ring reflect the world state, as you realise that many are way past their prime fighting forms. For example, the prime boss of the Caelid region is Starscourge Radahn, a once great and powerful warrior, with the coolest name to ever be put into fiction. As a result of the scarlet rot inflicted on him and the entire region of Caelid by Melania in their last fight, he has regressed to a feral state, mindlessly wandering the fields of battles fought long ago, consuming the flesh of both friends and foes. This is what I enjoyed about Elden Ring, as with added context, the fights become so much more than a guy you need to take down. It becomes more of a question of how much of what the Tarnished is doing isn't just to take the title of Elden Lord, but is also a form of mercy against those that have been ravaged by endless war. Another example of this is the Dragonlord Placidusax. Being the Elden Lord long before Queen Marika, the Dragonlord's god abandoned them, and the lands between long ago, and the Dragonlord patiently awaits their return. By the time you face the Dragonlord, you find a many-headed dragon, who is now missing some heads, and nowhere near as strong as they were when they were Elden Lord. Yet, they still command a power on a level that still makes them a very formidable threat. It gave me a sense of sadness to see those once great historical figures reduced to these hollowed-out shells of what they once were, and yet, the fact that they were all still immeasurably powerful made me think that the Tarnished couldn't have beaten them in full fighting form. The Greater Will was simply desperate, and the Tarnished was its only hope of re-establishing its control over the lands between. Knowing more about the story meant that by the time it came to the end of the game, and I had to choose the ending for my story, I opted to go with Ranni's ending. Mainly for the flex that I went the extra mile to do it, and if I'm being abundantly honest, I really didn't want my time with Elden Ring to end just yet, so I was more than happy to start doing side quests. But the more I looked into what Ranni's ending truly meant, the more satisfied I felt with the ending I'd achieved. Ranni's ending felt like the one that was most needed, a reset for the world, the breaking of a wheel perpetuated since the beginning of time by the Greater Will. It could be better than what came before, or worse, but at the end of the day, it feels like free will reigns above all else in whatever version of this world comes next, with no higher power for the world to answer to in a world crafted by Ranni and you. The story of Elden Ring has this ability to sneak up and surprise you, and you'll find yourself wanting to know more and more about the lore and mythos of the lands between as you play, and thankfully we'll be getting exactly that with the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC releasing soon. Now we move to a conclusion. Elden Ring surprised me in so many ways. I'm still unsure of what it did the second time around, but locked me in for the next 90 hours. Maybe it was because the gameplay loop never gets old. The boss fights, incredible, and the map is one of the most beautiful open worlds I've ever explored in a game. It brought about a level of emotional investment to its gameplay that I was not at all anticipating. I was screaming at my monitor like it was the Super Bowl, and I struggled to communicate the absolute feeling of elation that came with progression. Even if I had achieved a fraction of my success, perhaps even just beating Godric like I originally intended, I would still count it as a huge achievement. I have never understood the enjoyment factor of Souls-like games, but then again, I was never willing to give them a chance, which I now deeply regret, as I can say with full confidence that I really, truly get it now. I understand. Elden Ring has become one of my favourite games of all time, to the point where I'm mulling over the idea of a new game plus and going for the platinum. So I'm actually only 3 trophies away, which was surprising. But for now, I will wait for the DLC to come out first, then do it all over again. And that is the review of Elden Ring. This one was tricky. This one was tricky to do, given that it's a different kind of beast to the other games I've reviewed. Very high margin for error, in my opinion. But it's done now, and hopefully it'll sound good when I go back and edit it. And that's it. Thank you all very much for watching. The next review is probably going to be Senua's Saga, because I actually have that written as well. Yeah, that's going to be a fun one. Really looking forward to that. Might be a bit controversial, we'll find out. But yeah, thank you all very much for watching. I shall see you in the next video. Bye now.